My daughter-in-law mocked my cooking in front of his family, then spit it into the trash. I smiled. 10 minutes later, the house phone rang. After that, nobody touched their plates. But let me start from the beginning. Because what happened that evening changed everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself, and about the woman who had slowly been poisoning my life for the past 3 years. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing what I believed was my late mother-in-law's famous pot roast recipe. The same dish that had made Sunday dinners at this very table a tradition for over 40 years. My hands moved with practiced precision as I seasoned the meat, chopped the vegetables, and added what I thought were Helen's secret ingredients. At 62, I'd made this recipe countless times, but somehow it never tasted quite like hers did. Helen had been gone for 2 years now, and I missed her every single day. She was more than a mother-in-law to me. She was the mother I'd lost at 16. When David brought me home to meet his parents 35 years ago, Helen welcomed me with open arms and that warm smile that could make anyone feel like family.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
She taught me how to cook, how to manage a household, how to be the kind of wife her son deserved. The kitchen smelled divine as the roast finished cooking. I set the dining room table with Helen's good china, the set she'd insisted I have after the funeral. The crystal glasses caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, and for a moment, I felt her presence so strongly it took my breath away. This was going to be perfect. David's sister Carol was visiting with her husband Jim, and I wanted everything to be special. Jessica arrived fashionably late, as always. My daughter-in-law swept into the house like she owned it, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors that I'd spent the morning polishing. At 28, she was everything I had never been: confident, beautiful, and completely sure of her place in the world. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the October wind, and her makeup looked like it had been applied by a professional. "Something smells interesting," she said, the word interesting carrying just enough doubt to make me second-guess myself. She kissed David's cheek and nodded politely at Carol and Jim, but barely acknowledged me beyond a tight smile. I'd been trying to win Jessica over since the day David brought her home 3 years ago. I'd hosted birthday parties, baby showers, holiday dinners, always hoping that eventually she'd see me as family the way Helen had seen me. But every attempt seemed to fall short. Every gesture met with polite indifference that felt more cutting than outright hostility. "It's Helen's pot roast recipe," I said proudly, wiping my hands on my apron. "I thought it would be nice to have it again, especially with Carol visiting." Jessica's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, you mean the recipe she used to make? I'm sure you did your best with it." The word stung, but I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe she didn't mean anything by it. We gathered around the dining room table, and I served generous portions of the roast with roasted potatoes and green beans. The meat looked perfect, brown and tender, surrounded by vegetables that had cooked in the savory juices. David smiled and squeezed my hand as I sat down beside him. "This looks wonderful, sweetheart," he said, and I felt a warm glow of pride. After 33 years of marriage, his approval still meant everything to me. Carol took her first bite and nodded appreciatively. "It's delicious, Margaret. Thank you for going to all this trouble." I watched eagerly as Jessica cut a piece of meat and lifted it to her mouth. This was my chance to finally impress her, to show her that I could carry on Helen's traditions. She chewed thoughtfully for a moment, her expression neutral. Then she quietly reached for her napkin, pressed it to her mouth, and discreetly spit the food into it. My heart sank, but I told myself maybe she'd bitten into a piece of gristle or something tough. These things happen, but then she did something that made the blood drain from my face. Jessica pushed back from the table, walked to the kitchen, and scraped her entire plate into the trash can. The sound of the fork against the plate echoed through the suddenly quiet house. When she returned to the dining room, all eyes were on her. David looked confused. Carol appeared uncomfortable, and Jim had stopped eating mid-bite. "I'm sorry," Jessica said, her voice carrying a tone of practiced sympathy that made my skin crawl. "I just can't eat this. It's so over-salted and dry I almost choked." She turned to David with those big blue eyes that had captured him from the first moment they met. "Honey, I don't want to hurt your mom's feelings, but this doesn't taste anything like your grandmother's cooking." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt heat rise to my cheeks as shame washed over me. Had I really ruined Helen's recipe so badly? How could I have gotten it so wrong? David cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, maybe it just needs a little adjustment, Mom. You know how tricky these old family recipes can be." Carol nodded, though I noticed she'd stopped eating too. Maybe the oven temperature was off, or perhaps the cut of meat was different. Their attempts to soften the blow only made it worse. I wanted to disappear into the floor, to never have to face the disappointment in their eyes again. All those years of trying to live up to Helen's memory, and I'd failed so spectacularly that Jessica couldn't even pretend to choke it down. "I think Margaret tries very hard," Jessica continued, her voice dripping with false kindness. "But sometimes older people lose their sense of taste, don't they? It's completely natural. Maybe it's time to consider letting someone else handle the cooking for family gatherings." Someone else. Meaning her, of course. I sat there, speechless, as she continued to dissect my failure with surgical precision, each word wrapped in concern but sharp as a blade. I remember Helen's pot roast being so tender and flavorful. She had such a gift for seasoning. "This is just..." She gestured helplessly at my plate, leaving the sentence unfinished but the meaning crystal clear. I looked around the table at my family, searching for someone to defend me, to say that maybe Jessica was being too harsh. But David avoided my eyes. Carol stared at her napkin, and Jim seemed fascinated by the pattern on his water glass. The worst part was that deep down, I was starting to believe her. Maybe I had lost my touch. Maybe age was catching up with me in ways I hadn't noticed. Maybe I really was becoming the doddering old woman Jessica seemed to think I was. I excused myself to get dessert, though my appetite had completely vanished. In the kitchen, I stared at the pot roast I'd been so proud of just an hour ago. It looked the same as it had when I'd pulled it from the oven, but now all I could see were its flaws. Too dark, too dry, too much salt, just like Jessica said. I was standing there, tears threatening to spill over, when the phone rang. "Mrs. Patterson? This is Dr. Martinez from St. Mary's Hospital. I was your mother-in-law, Helen's physician, before she passed. I know this is unusual, but I was going through some old files, and I found something I think you should know about Helen's medical condition. Something about her dietary restrictions that might be important for family recipes." My hand tightened on the phone. "What kind of dietary restrictions?" "Helen had severe diabetes in her final years. Mrs. Patterson. She couldn't have salt or sugar in any significant amounts. I'm calling because I remember her mentioning that she was worried about passing down her recipes without explaining the modifications she'd had to make." The kitchen seemed to tilt around me. No salt, no sugar, but the recipe I'd been using, the one Jessica claimed to remember so well, was full of both. "Doctor," I said, my voice barely steady, "are you saying Helen had to change all her recipes because of her condition?" "Oh yes, drastically. She was quite upset about it, actually. Said she was afraid the family would think she'd lost her touch when really she was just trying to stay alive." I hung up the phone with trembling hands, my mind racing. If Helen couldn't use salt or sugar, then the recipe I'd been making wasn't hers at all. But where had I gotten it? Who had taught me to make it this way? And then, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place, I remembered. It was Jessica who had insisted on helping me make Helen's pot roast for the first time after the funeral. Jessica who had guided me through the seasoning, who had added the salt and sugar while I watched, thinking she was helping me honor Helen's memory. Jessica, who had just humiliated me in front of my entire family for making a recipe she had taught me herself. I walked slowly back to the dining room, where the conversation had moved on to other topics. Jessica was laughing at something David had said, completely at ease, while my untouched dinner sat before me like evidence of my failure. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't looking at Jessica with hurt or confusion or desperate hope for acceptance. I was looking at her with the cold, clear eyes of someone who had finally seen the truth, and that truth was going to change everything. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed next to David, listening to his steady breathing while my mind raced through 3 years of memories. Every failed dinner, every disappointed comment, every gentle suggestion that maybe I should try a different approach. Had it all been lies? At 4 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and crept downstairs to the kitchen. I pulled out my recipe box, the wooden one Helen had given me for my birthday 15 years ago. My fingers traced the familiar cards, written in my own careful handwriting. But as I looked at them now, something felt wrong. The measurements, the ingredients, they didn't match what I remembered watching Helen make. I'd attributed the differences to my own faulty memory. Now I wondered if there was a different explanation entirely. I found the pot roast card. In the margin, written in my handwriting but somehow foreign now, were the words, Jessica's suggestions, more salt, brown sugar. I stared at those words until my eyes burned. I had no memory of writing them, but there they were. When David came down for coffee 2 hours later, he found me sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by recipe cards. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice gentle with concern. I looked up at my husband and wondered how to explain what I was beginning to understand. "David, do you remember your mother's cooking being very salty or sweet?" He paused in pouring his coffee, frowning. "Mom's cooking? No, actually. I remember it being pretty bland toward the end. She used to joke about eating like she was on a diet." He sat down across from me. "Why?" My heart started beating faster. "Her doctor called yesterday. After dinner, he said she had severe diabetes and couldn't eat salt or sugar. He said she had to modify all her recipes." David set down his mug with a sharp clink. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the recipes I've been making aren't hers at all. They're what someone told me hers were." I picked up the pot roast card. "Look at this. I wrote down Jessica's suggestions right here. She helped me make this recipe for the first time after the funeral. She said she'd watched your mother make it dozens of times." The color slowly drained from David's face. "But that would mean Jessica has been setting me up to fail for 3 years. David was quiet for a long moment, staring at the recipe card. I could see him struggling with the idea. It was easier to believe I was a bad cook than to accept that someone we'd welcomed into our family had been systematically destroying my confidence. "Maybe there's another explanation," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. I wanted to believe him, but I'd spent too many sleepless hours putting the pieces together, and they formed a picture too clear to ignore. "David, think about it. Every family dinner, every holiday, Jessica has had something to say about my cooking, and it's never been positive. She always compares it to how Helen used to make it, always finds it lacking." My husband rubbed his face with both hands. "But why would she do that?" "Because she wants to be the one everyone turns to. She wants to be the family cook, the one who carries on traditions. She can't do that if I'm already doing it successfully." The words hung in the air between us, ugly and raw. I watched David process them, watched him remember all the times Jessica had stepped in to help with meals, all the times she'd offered to take over holiday cooking. "I need to see Mom's real recipe box," I said suddenly. "The one she kept in her bedroom. We never went through it after the funeral. You said it was too painful." David nodded slowly. "It's still in the attic." An hour later, we were in the dusty attic, surrounded by boxes labeled in Helen's neat handwriting. I found the one marked kitchen and opened it with reverent hands. Inside was her real recipe box, the old tin one she'd used for 50 years. The recipes inside were written in Helen's familiar script, but they were nothing like the ones I'd been using. No salt in the pot roast, no sugar in the apple pie, herbs and spices for flavor, but none of the heavy seasonings that had made my versions taste so different. At the bottom of the box, I found something that made my breath catch. A small notebook titled Modified Recipes for My Health. Each page contained 2 versions of the same dish, the original family recipe and the modified version she'd had to make in her final years. But there was more. Tucked between the pages were letters Helen had written but never sent, addressed to me. "My dear Margaret," the first one began, "I wish I could teach you the real recipes instead of these bland versions I have to make now. When I'm gone, please don't think less of my cooking because of what you've seen lately. I sat on the attic floor and cried for the mother-in-law who had worried that I would remember her as a woman who had lost her touch in the kitchen. She had died believing that her legacy would be remembered as disappointment, never knowing that someone would use that insecurity against me. David found another letter, dated just 2 months before Helen's death. "I worry about Margaret," it read. "That new girl seems sweet enough, but there's something in her eyes when she looks at Margaret. I've seen that look before, in women who see other women as competition instead of family." My hands shook as I read Helen's words. She had seen it. She had recognized something in Jessica that the rest of us had missed. "She knew," I whispered. "She knew Jessica would try to replace me." We climbed down from the attic carrying Helen's real recipe box, and I spent the rest of the morning reading through her notes. Each page revealed the woman I thought I'd known, but had only seen through the filter of illness. The real Helen had been bold with flavors, generous with portions, confident in her abilities. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I made Helen's apple pie using her original recipe, not the modified version she'd had to use, and not the overly sweet version Jessica had helped me create. The pie that came out of the oven was golden and perfect, fragrant with cinnamon and nutmeg. It was exactly the way I remembered Helen's pies tasting before her illness. David took one bite and closed his eyes. "That's it," he said softly. "That's exactly how Mom's pie used to taste." I felt a satisfaction deeper than pride. I felt like I was finally honoring Helen's memory the way she had wanted to be honored. When Jessica came by that evening for her weekly visit, she found us in the kitchen, Helen's real recipe box open on the counter. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. I looked at her and smiled. "I found Helen's real recipes, the ones she used before she got sick. It turns out everything I've been making has been wrong." For just a moment, I saw something flicker across Jessica's face. Fear. Maybe, or calculation. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "How interesting," she said, moving closer to examine the recipe box. "I wonder how that happened." "I wonder too," I replied, never taking my eyes off her face. "I found some notes about modifications she had to make because of her diabetes. Funny thing is, all the recipes I've been using had the exact opposite modifications." Jessica's smile didn't waver, but I noticed her hands clench slightly. "Well, these old family recipes get passed down so many different ways." "That's true," I agreed pleasantly. "But I also found letters Helen wrote about being worried that her recipes would be remembered wrong after she died." "How sad," Jessica murmured, but her eyes had gone cold. As she left that night, I watched her through the window. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't wondering what I'd done wrong. I was wondering what she would do next, now that she knew I was no longer the confused woman she'd been manipulating, because Jessica wasn't the type to give up easily. And now that I'd found the truth, the real game was about to begin. Jessica's reaction told me everything I needed to know. Over the next few days, she began what I can only describe as a campaign to discredit my discoveries. She started small, the way she always did, with little comments that seemed innocent enough on the surface, but carried just enough poison to do their damage. "I've been thinking about those recipes you found," she said to David when she thought I was out of earshot. "Don't you think it's odd that your mother would hide her real recipes? Maybe Margaret misunderstood what she found." She called Carol, David's sister, with concerns about my obsession with Helen's old things. "I'm worried she's creating some fantasy about hidden recipes to make herself feel better about her cooking," I heard her say during a phone conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. You know how older people sometimes get confused about these things. But Jessica had made a crucial mistake. She had underestimated how well Helen had documented everything, and she had underestimated my determination now that I knew the truth. I spent hours going through Helen's notebook, not just reading the recipes but studying her notes in the margins. Helen had been meticulous, recording not just ingredients and measurements but the reasons behind every modification. "Doctor says no salt. Try rosemary and thyme instead." "Blood sugar too high. Substitute applesauce for sugar in muffins." Each change was explained. Each compromise documented with the precision of someone who refused to let illness defeat her completely. More importantly, I found Helen's original recipes, the ones she'd used for decades before diabetes forced her to change everything. These weren't the bland, modified versions Jessica had seen in Helen's final years, and they certainly weren't the over-salted, over-sweetened disasters Jessica had taught me to make. I began practicing in secret, making small batches when Jessica wasn't around. David's favorite chocolate chip cookies, Helen's famous dinner rolls, the beef stew that had been a family staple for 30 years. Each success felt like a small victory. Each perfect dish, another piece of evidence that I wasn't losing my mind or my abilities. But I wasn't just cooking. I was planning. Jessica had built her reputation in this family as the voice of reason, the helpful daughter-in-law who stepped in when poor Margaret couldn't manage anymore. She'd positioned herself as Helen's true heir in the kitchen, the one who really understood the family traditions. It was a carefully constructed image, and I was going to tear it down brick by brick. The opportunity came when Jessica suggested hosting Thanksgiving at our house. "Since Margaret has been having trouble with the family recipes," she said to David, her voice full of false concern, "maybe I should take over the cooking this year. I wouldn't want everyone to be disappointed again." David looked uncomfortable. Since finding Helen's letters, he'd been quieter around Jessica, more observant. "I don't know," he said slowly. "Mom's been cooking Thanksgiving for 30 years. But honey," Jessica pressed, placing her hand on his arm in that possessive way she had, "after what happened with the pot roast, don't you think it would be better if I handled things? I remember exactly how your mother used to make everything." I looked up from the magazine I'd been pretending to read. "Actually, Jessica, I'd love for you to help me cook Thanksgiving dinner. We could make it together, using Helen's real recipes." The smile froze on her face. Her real recipes? The ones I found in the attic. The original ones, from before she got sick. I kept my voice light. Friendly even. "It would be wonderful to have your help making sure everything is exactly the way Helen used to make it." I watched her try to process this, saw the calculation behind her eyes. She couldn't refuse without seeming unwilling to help. But accepting meant she'd have to cook alongside me using recipes she'd never actually seen Helen use. "Of course," she said finally. "I'd be happy to help." Over the next 2 weeks, I began what I privately called my education campaign. I shared Helen's notebook with Carol, showing her the letters her mother had written about worrying that her recipes would be remembered wrong. I talked to David about the differences between the modified recipes Helen had to use and the original ones she'd perfected over decades. Most importantly, I invited our extended family to contribute their own memories of Helen's cooking. David's Aunt Mary had copies of some of Helen's original recipes from the 1970s. His cousin Tom remembered the exact way Helen made her stuffing, with details that matched the notebook perfectly but contradicted everything Jessica had ever told us. I always wondered why Helen's stuffing tasted so different in her last few years, Aunt Mary said when I called her. "It used to be so savory and rich, but toward the end it was almost bland. I thought maybe she'd just lost interest in cooking. She had to cut out most of the salt and herbs because of her diabetes," I explained. "But I found her original recipe, the one she used for 30 years before she got sick." "Oh, Margaret, that's wonderful. I'd love to help you make it the right way again." One by one, I reached out to family members, sharing Helen's story and gathering their memories. Each conversation added another layer to the picture I was building, another witness to the fact that Helen's cooking had indeed changed dramatically in her final years, and that the recipes Jessica claimed to remember so well were nothing like what Helen had actually made for most of her life. Jessica began to sense that something was shifting. She started dropping by more frequently, always with offers to help or suggestions for how things should be done. She brought me a recipe for green bean casserole that she swore was Helen's, but when I compared it to the version in Helen's notebook, it was completely different. "Are you sure this is how Helen made it?" I asked, holding up both versions. Jessica barely glanced at Helen's handwritten card. "Oh, that old thing. She probably wrote that down wrong." "Memory problems, you know how it is. The version I gave you is definitely the one she made for family dinners, but I'd already called 3 family members who remembered Helen's green bean casserole, and their descriptions matched Helen's notebook exactly. Jessica's version included ingredients Helen had never used, and techniques Helen would have found unnecessarily complicated. The lies were becoming more obvious, more desperate. Jessica seemed to realize that her carefully constructed narrative was falling apart, but she couldn't figure out how to stop it without admitting that she'd been lying all along. The week before Thanksgiving, she made her boldest move yet. She arrived at our house with 2 bags of groceries and a determined smile. "I thought I'd get started on some of the prep work," she announced, unpacking expensive ingredients onto my counter. "I want to make sure everything is perfect." I watched her pull out items that weren't on any of Helen's recipes, premium cuts of meat and exotic seasonings that Helen had never used. "What are you planning to make with all this?" "Helen's famous sage dressing," she said confidently. "The one everyone always raved about. I thought I'd get it started early so the flavors have time to develop." I opened Helen's notebook to the dressing recipe, the one Helen had called, "My mother's stuffing never changed this." The ingredients Jessica had brought bore no resemblance to Helen's simple, traditional recipe. "Jessica," I said quietly, "Helen's dressing recipe doesn't call for any of these ingredients." "Of course it does," she said, but there was an edge to her voice now. "I watched her make it every year for 3 years. I know exactly how she did it. But you only knew her for 3 years, and those were the years when she couldn't use most seasonings because of her diabetes." I held up Helen's notebook. "This is the recipe she used for 40 years before she got sick, the one everyone remembers." Jessica stared at the notebook as if it were a snake that might bite her. "That's not possible. She would have told me if she'd changed the recipe." "Why would she tell you about a recipe she couldn't make anymore? She was probably embarrassed about having to serve bland food to her family. She wouldn't have wanted to dwell on what she'd lost." For a moment, Jessica's mask slipped completely. I saw frustration, anger, and something that looked almost like panic flash across her face. Then she pulled herself together, forcing another smile. "Well, I suppose we should stick to the old family recipes then," she said. But her voice was tight. "Though I have to say, I'm surprised Helen never mentioned that she'd been making everything differently." "She mentioned it to me," I said gently. "In her letters. She was very worried that the family would remember her as someone who'd lost her touch in the kitchen, when really she was just trying to stay healthy." That night, David found me in the kitchen, reading through Helen's notebook for the 100th time. "You're really going through with this?" he asked. "With what?" "With proving that Jessica has been lying about Mom's recipes." I looked up at my husband, this man who'd stood by silently while his wife humiliated me for 3 years. "I'm not trying to prove anything." "David, I'm just trying to honor your mother's memory by making her food the way she actually made it." He sat down across from me, his expression troubled. "But if you're right about this, if Jessica has been... if she's been deliberately sabotaging me? Deliberately making me feel like a failure in my own kitchen? Deliberately positioning herself as the keeper of your family's traditions while making sure I could never live up to them?" I kept my voice calm, matter of fact. "Yes, David, that's exactly what she's been doing." The silence stretched between us, heavy with 3 years of unspoken truths. Finally, David reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have seen it. I should have protected you." "You see it now," I replied. "That's what matters." As Thanksgiving approached, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. Jessica could bring all the wrong ingredients she wanted, could tell all the false stories about Helen's cooking that she could remember. It wouldn't matter, because this time, I had the truth on my side. And the truth, as Helen had written in one of her letters, has a way of rising to the surface like cream in fresh milk. All I had to do was let it happen. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of November wind that rattled windows and made you grateful to be inside with a warm kitchen. I was up before dawn, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted everything to be perfect. Not perfect in the way Jessica demanded, flawless and impressive, but perfect in the way Helen would have wanted it. Made with love, seasoned with care, and true to the recipes that had fed our family for generations. Jessica arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, armed with her bags of wrong ingredients and a confidence that would have been admirable if it hadn't been built on 3 years of lies. She swept into my kitchen like she owned it, which in a way she'd been trying to do all along. "I thought we'd start with the stuffing," she announced, unpacking her expensive sage and imported breadcrumbs. "It needs the most time to develop its flavors." I was already at the counter with Helen's notebook open to the stuffing page, surrounded by the simple ingredients the recipe actually called for: day-old bread that I'd cubed and dried myself, celery, onions, butter, chicken broth, and the most basic seasonings you could imagine. "Actually," I said mildly, "I've already started Helen's stuffing. Would you like to see how she really made it?" Jessica's smile tightened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Oh, that's sweet, Margaret. But I think you might be confused about the ingredients. Helen's stuffing was much more sophisticated than that." I opened Helen's notebook to the page where she'd written, in her careful script, "Mother's stuffing recipe, exactly as she taught me in 1962. Never change this. It's perfect as it is." Below that were detailed notes about technique, timing, and the importance of not over-seasoning. "This is how Helen made stuffing for 40 years, I said, turning the notebook so Jessica could see it, "before she had to modify everything for her diabetes." For just a moment, Jessica looked genuinely confused, as if she couldn't reconcile what she was seeing with what she thought she knew. Then her expression hardened. "Well, recipes evolve," she said dismissively. "Helen probably simplified things as she got older. The version I remember was much more complex." "The version you remember was the diabetes version," I said gently. "She had to leave out most of the butter and all the salt. What you saw wasn't Helen's real cooking. It was what she had to settle for." Jessica's jaw tightened. But before she could respond, Carol arrived with her family, followed by Aunt Mary and Cousin Tom. The kitchen filled with the warm chaos of family gathering, hugs and laughter, and the comfortable noise of people who belonged together. "Oh, Margaret," Aunt Mary exclaimed, peering over my shoulder at the stuffing mixture. "That looks exactly like Helen used to make it. I haven't seen it look that way in years." "That's because this is Helen's original recipe," I explained, showing her the notebook. "The one she used before she got sick." Aunt Mary's eyes filled with tears as she read Helen's notes. She was so proud of this recipe. It was her mother's, you know. 4 generations of women in our family made stuffing exactly this way. Jessica had gone very still, watching this exchange with calculating eyes. I could see her trying to figure out how to regain control of the narrative, how to position herself as the expert in the face of mounting evidence that she'd never really known Helen's cooking at all. "It's wonderful that you found these old recipes," she said finally, her voice carefully measured. "But I think we should be practical about this. Some of these ingredients might not work well together. Helen might have simplified things for a reason." "What reason would that be?" Tom asked, looking genuinely curious. Jessica floundered for a moment. "Well, modern palates are different. What tasted good 50 years ago might seem bland now." I saw Aunt Mary's eyebrows rise at this, and I knew Jessica had made a crucial error. Aunt Mary had been eating Helen's cooking for 60 years, and she knew the difference between Helen's real recipes and the modified versions better than anyone. "Helen's original cooking was never bland," Aunt Mary said firmly. "It was rich and flavorful and absolutely delicious. The only time it got bland was in her last few years when she couldn't use salt or butter because of her health problems." The kitchen fell quiet for a moment, the weight of this statement settling over everyone present. David, who had been carving the turkey, looked up from his work. "Jessica," he said slowly, "how exactly do you remember Mom's stuffing being made?" It was a simple question, but I could see the trap it presented. Jessica could either admit that she only knew the modified, diabetes-friendly versions of Helen's recipes, or she could double down on her lies and risk being contradicted by people who had 40 more years of experience with Helen's cooking. She chose to double down. "Helen used fresh herbs," she said confidently. "Lots of sage, thyme, rosemary, and she always added wine to the bread mixture for depth of flavor." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in that kitchen knew Helen well enough to know that she'd been a simple cook who believed good ingredients didn't need to be dressed up with complicated techniques. Mom never cooked with wine, Carol said quietly. She didn't even keep it in the house, and she never used fresh herbs, Tom added. She always said dried herbs were more reliable and lasted longer. Jessica's face flushed red. Well, maybe she made it differently when I was around. Maybe she wanted to impress me. The words hung in the air like smoke, and I saw everyone in the kitchen register their implications. Jessica had just suggested that Helen, a woman who'd been cooking for her family for 50 years, had felt the need to change her methods to impress a daughter-in-law she'd known for 3 years. Jessica, I said softly. Helen wrote in her notebook that this stuffing recipe should never be changed because it was already perfect. She made it the same way for 40 years. The only time she changed it was when her doctor told her she had to. I could see Jessica realizing that she'd painted herself into a corner. Every person in this kitchen had memories of Helen's real cooking, and those memories didn't match the elaborate versions Jessica claimed to remember. I think, David said carefully, that maybe Jessica is remembering the Thanksgiving dinners from Mom's last few years, when she was already sick and having to modify everything. It was an olive branch, a way for Jessica to save face by admitting to a mistake rather than an intentional deception. For a moment, I thought she might take it. Instead, she doubled down again. No, she said firmly. I know what I saw. I helped Helen cook several times, and she definitely used fresh herbs and wine. Maybe you're all misremembering because it was so long ago. The suggestion that 5 people who'd known Helen for decades were all misremembering while Jessica, who'd known her for 3 years during her illness, had the correct memories, was so absurd that no one knew how to respond to it. Finally, Aunt Mary spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. Jessica, dear, I think you might be confused about what you saw. Helen stopped using most seasonings and all alcohol in her cooking when she was diagnosed with diabetes. If you helped her cook, you would have seen the modified versions of her recipes, not the originals. I'm not confused, Jessica snapped, her composure finally cracking. I know what I saw. I know how Helen cooked. Then prove it, I said quietly. Everyone turned to look at me, surprised by the directness of the challenge. If you know how Helen really made her stuffing, I continued, make it. Show us. Use whatever ingredients you think are right, and we'll see which version tastes like the Helen everyone else remembers. Jessica stared at me, trapped between her lies and the truth. She could either admit that she didn't actually know Helen's recipes, or she could try to make stuffing using ingredients Helen had never used and hope no one would notice the difference. Fine, she said, her chin raised defiantly. I'll show you exactly how Helen made her stuffing. She began pulling ingredients from her bags, expensive items that Helen would never have bought. Fresh herbs, wine, artisanal breadcrumbs, imported seasonings. As she worked, I could see the doubt creeping into the faces of everyone watching. This wasn't how Helen cooked. This wasn't how Helen had ever cooked. 20 minutes later, we had 2 versions of stuffing sitting side by side. Mine, made from Helen's original recipe with simple ingredients and careful technique. Jessica's, loaded with expensive additions and aggressive seasonings that masked rather than enhanced the basic flavors. Well, I said, handing out spoons, let's see which one tastes like Helen's. The verdict was unanimous and swift. Tom took 1 bite of Jessica's version and made a face. This doesn't taste anything like Grandma Helen's stuffing. Carol tried mine and closed her eyes. Oh my God, Margaret, this is exactly how I remember it. This is exactly how Mom used to make it. One by one, each family member tasted both versions and reached the same conclusion. My version, made from Helen's original recipe, tasted exactly like the stuffing they remembered from decades of family dinners. Jessica's version, for all its expensive ingredients and complex preparation, tasted like something Helen would never have made. Jessica stood frozen in the middle of my kitchen, watching her carefully constructed lies crumble around her. Her face cycled through emotions, anger, embarrassment, desperation, before settling on something I'd never seen from her before. Defeat. I don't understand, she whispered. But even she didn't sound convinced by her own words anymore. David put his arm around my shoulders, something he hadn't done in front of Jessica in 3 years. "Mom," he said softly, "I'm sorry. I should have trusted you." As we sat down to our Thanksgiving dinner, Jessica picked at her food in silence while the rest of the family praised every dish. The turkey was perfectly seasoned. The stuffing was exactly as they remembered, and the green bean casserole tasted like Helen had made it herself. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like the cook I'd always been. Not perfect, not fancy, but capable of feeding my family with love and skill and respect for the traditions that had been passed down to me. And Jessica, for the first time since I'd known her, had nothing to say about my cooking at all. The days following Thanksgiving passed in an uncomfortable silence. Jessica had left that evening without saying goodbye, claiming she felt a migraine coming on. But I knew the truth. She couldn't face the reality of what had happened in my kitchen. Couldn't bear to sit through dessert while everyone praised the very recipes she'd spent 3 years convincing me I couldn't make properly. David tried to act like nothing had changed, but I could see him watching Jessica differently now, paying attention to the little comments and corrections that had become such a constant part of our family dynamic. 3 days after Thanksgiving, he came home from work looking troubled. "Jessica wants to have lunch tomorrow," he said, hanging up his coat. "Just the 3 of us. She says we need to clear the air about what happened." I wasn't surprised. Jessica wasn't the type to simply accept defeat and fade quietly into the background. She would want to reframe the narrative, to find a way to make herself the victim of some misunderstanding rather than the architect of 3 years of deliberate cruelty. "What do you want to do?" David asked. I thought about it for a moment, standing in the kitchen where I'd rediscovered my confidence, surrounded by Helen's recipes and the lingering satisfaction of that perfect Thanksgiving dinner. "I want to hear what she has to say," I said finally. "I think it's time we all stopped pretending." We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of neutral territory where people go to have difficult conversations. Jessica was already there when we arrived, perfectly put together as always, but I could see the strain around her eyes, the careful way she held herself like someone preparing for battle. "Thank you both for coming," she said as we sat down. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since Thursday, and I realize there may have been some miscommunication about Helen's recipes." Miscommunication. Even now, she couldn't bring herself to admit what she'd done. "What kind of miscommunication?" David asked, his voice carefully neutral. Jessica took a sip of her coffee, buying herself time. "Well, I think Margaret may have misunderstood some things I said about Helen's cooking. I was only trying to help, but maybe I wasn't as clear as I should have been." I watched her perform this delicate dance around the truth, marveling at her ability to twist reality even in the face of overwhelming evidence. "What things do you think I misunderstood?" "When I helped you with those recipes after Helen's funeral, I was working from memory of how she cooked in her last few years. I didn't realize at the time that she'd been modifying everything because of her health problems." Jessica's voice carried just the right note of regret, as if this were all an innocent mistake. If I'd known she'd changed all her recipes, I would have been more careful about what I suggested. It was a masterful performance, really. She was admitting to giving me wrong information while simultaneously claiming ignorance about Helen's condition and positioning herself as another victim of the circumstances. If I hadn't found Helen's letters, if I hadn't seen the truth with my own eyes, I might have believed her. "But Jessica," I said gently, "you told everyone at Thanksgiving that you helped Helen cook several times and that she used fresh herbs and wine. That's not something you could have misremembered." A flash of irritation crossed her face before she smoothed it away. I think in the heat of the moment, trying to defend what I thought was right, I may have overstated some things. "You know how it is when you're trying to make a point." David leaned forward. "So you're saying you lied about helping Mom cook?" "I wouldn't call it lying," Jessica said quickly. "I would call it defending what I believed to be true based on my limited experience." I almost admired the sophistication of her word choices. She was admitting to everything while admitting to nothing, acknowledging her errors while denying any malicious intent. "Jessica," I said, setting down my coffee cup, I found letters Helen wrote about you. The color drained from her face. What letters? Letters she wrote but never sent, talking about her concerns about how you looked at me, how you seemed to see me as competition rather than family. I kept my voice calm, matter of fact. She was worried about what would happen after she died. Jessica's composure finally cracked. That's not possible. Helen loved me. She always said I was like the daughter she never had. She did love you, I agreed, but she also saw through you. She recognized that you resented me, that you wanted to take my place in the family. She just didn't know how to address it without causing problems between you and David. You're making this up, Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. Helen never wrote any letters about me. David pulled out his phone and opened to a photo he'd taken of one of Helen's letters. This is Mom's handwriting, Jessica. I've seen it my whole life. He turned the phone so she could see it. She wrote about being worried that you saw Margaret as competition, about hoping you would learn to work together instead of trying to replace her. Jessica stared at the phone screen, her face cycling through emotions I couldn't quite read. When she looked up, there was something desperate in her eyes. Even if she did write that, it doesn't mean anything. Old people get paranoid sometimes. They imagine things that aren't there. She also wrote about your reaction to her modified recipes, I continued. She said you always seemed disappointed when her food didn't taste the way it used to, and she wondered if you were using that disappointment to make me feel inadequate. Stop. Jessica's voice was sharp now, all pretense of regret gone. Just stop. You're twisting everything to make me look like some kind of villain. I'm not twisting anything, I said. I'm just telling you what Helen wrote in her own words. She saw what you were doing, Jessica. She knew you were sabotaging me. I never sabotaged anyone. Jessica's voice rose, drawing looks from other diners. I tried to help you cook better. I tried to teach you Helen's recipes. You taught me the wrong recipes, I said quietly. You taught me versions that would fail, that would make me look incompetent, that would give you an excuse to take over the family cooking. Jessica stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. You're both insane if you believe this fantasy. Sit down. Jessica. David's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. We're not done talking. She remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides. Yes, we are done. I don't have to sit here and listen to this paranoid nonsense. The paranoid nonsense is documented in Helen's own handwriting, David said. She saw what you were doing to Margaret. She wrote about it. She was concerned enough to document it. Fine, Jessica exploded. Fine, maybe I did give Margaret some wrong suggestions. Maybe I did remember Helen's recipes incorrectly. But I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was just trying to fit in, trying to be part of the family. The admission hung in the air between us, raw and ugly. She'd finally said it, finally acknowledged what we all knew to be true. By making me fail? I asked. By making me doubt myself? By positioning yourself as the expert while ensuring I could never succeed? Jessica sank back into her chair, the fight going out of her all at once. You don't understand what it's like, she said, her voice small now. Everyone always talked about Helen like she was perfect. Helen's cooking, Helen's traditions, Helen's way of doing things. I could never live up to that. But you got to be her heir automatically, just because you'd been in the family longer. There it was, finally. The truth behind 3 years of careful manipulation and psychological warfare. Jessica hadn't just wanted to be part of the family. She'd wanted to be the most important part, the irreplaceable part, and she'd seen me as an obstacle to that goal. So you decided to remove the obstacle, David said, his voice heavy with disappointment. I didn't plan it that way, Jessica said, tears starting to flow. It just happened. When I realized Margaret didn't really know Helen's original recipes, when I saw how easily she believed what I told her, it was like an opportunity. An opportunity to destroy my confidence and take my place, I said. Jessica nodded miserably. I thought if I could become the one everyone turned to for family recipes, for family traditions, then I'd really belong. I'd be necessary. I looked at this young woman who had spent 3 years systematically undermining me, and I felt something unexpected, pity, not forgiveness. Not absolution, but a sad understanding of the insecurity and need that had driven her to such cruelty. "Jessica," I said softly, "you already belonged. David loved you. We all welcomed you into the family. You didn't need to push me out to make room for yourself." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "But you were so good at everything. Everyone loved you. I felt like I was always competing with a ghost, Helen's memory, and with you, who knew all her secrets." "I didn't know her secrets," I said. "I was learning too, making mistakes too. We could have learned together." "I know that now," she whispered. "But then I just wanted to win. I wanted to be the one who mattered." David reached across the table and took my hand. "Margaret is the one who matters," he said firmly. "She's my wife. She's the woman who's taken care of our family for 33 years. And she's the one who truly understood Mom's legacy." Jessica flinched as if he'd slapped her. "What happens now?" David and I exchanged glances. This was the moment we'd both been dreading and anticipating. The moment when we had to decide what consequences looked like for 3 years of systematic emotional abuse. "Now," David said slowly, "you need to decide what kind of person you want to be going forward. Because the person you've been for the past 3 years isn't welcome in our family anymore." Jessica stared at him, then at me, searching for some sign of softness, some indication that this could all be smoothed over and forgotten. But I was done being soft. I was done making excuses for someone who had made me doubt my own abilities, my own worth, my own place in the family I'd helped build. "I want you to leave," I said simply. "I want you to go home, pack your things, and figure out who you are when you're not tearing other people down to build yourself up." The silence that followed was broken only by the quiet sounds of the cafe around us. Finally, Jessica nodded, wiping her eyes with her napkin. "I'm sorry," she said. And for the first time in 3 years, she sounded like she actually meant it. But sorry wasn't enough. Not anymore. 6 months have passed since that conversation at the cafe. And I'm sitting in my kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning, making Helen's cinnamon rolls from her original recipe. The dough is soft and pliable under my hands, and the smell of cinnamon and butter fills the air just the way it used to when Helen made them for Sunday breakfast 30 years ago. Jessica left town 3 weeks after our confrontation. She took a job in Seattle. David told me something about needing a fresh start. She sent a letter to David before she left, but I never asked what it said. Some apologies are too little and too late to matter, and I'd moved beyond needing her acknowledgement of what she'd done to me. The kitchen feels different now, lighter somehow. It's the same kitchen I've cooked in for 33 years, but without the weight of constant judgment, without the fear of failure hanging over every meal I prepare. It's become a place of joy again. I cook when I want to cook, what I want to cook, and I do it with the confidence that comes from knowing I actually am good at this. David and I have been rebuilding too. It's taken time for him to fully understand the extent of what Jessica did, not just to me, but to our marriage. 3 years of him siding with her opinions over mine. 3 years of treating me like I was becoming incompetent when really I was being sabotaged. That doesn't heal overnight. But we're working on it. He's been taking cooking lessons with me, learning Helen's real recipes, understanding the difference between the bland, modified food his mother had to eat in her final years and the rich, flavorful dishes she'd made for most of her life. Last week, he successfully made her pot roast from the original recipe, and when he tasted it, I saw tears in his eyes. "This is exactly how I remember it," he said. "This is exactly how it tasted when I was a kid." The family gatherings are different now, too. Carol comes over more often, and she's been teaching me some of Helen's recipes that I'd never learned. The Christmas cookies Helen made every December. The special birthday cake she made for each grandchild. We spend hours in the kitchen together, sharing stories about Helen and recreating the flavors that made our family gatherings special. Aunt Mary has become a regular visitor as well. She brings her own collection of family recipes, the ones she learned from Helen's mother back in the 1950s. We compare notes, share techniques, and slowly piece together a more complete picture of the cooking traditions that shaped our family. "You know," she told me last month while we were making Helen's apple butter, "Helen would be so proud of what you're doing. She always worried that her recipes would be lost or remembered wrong. She'd love knowing that you found the real ones and that you're keeping them alive." I think about Helen often when I cook now, not with the sadness and inadequacy I used to feel, but with gratitude for the legacy she left me. Her notebooks have become my most treasured possessions, filled with decades of cooking wisdom, family history, and love letters disguised as recipe modifications. The letter that means the most to me is one I found tucked behind a recipe for sugar cookies. Margaret, it read, "You have such a gift for making people feel loved through food. Don't ever let anyone convince you that you're not a wonderful cook. The secret ingredient in any recipe is the love you put into it, and you have more love to give than anyone I know." I read that letter whenever I doubt myself, whenever the old fears creep back in. Helen saw who I really was, appreciated what I brought to the family, and trusted me with her most precious recipes. Jessica's opinion of my cooking had never mattered, but it took me 3 years to remember that. The changes in my life extend beyond the kitchen, too. I've started volunteering at the community center, teaching cooking classes for seniors. Many of them have stories similar to mine. Family members who've dismissed their abilities, grown children who think they know better, daughters-in-law who've made them feel obsolete. The thing is, I told my class last week as we worked on basic bread making, we're not obsolete. We're the keepers of traditions, the holders of recipes and techniques that can't be Googled or learned from YouTube videos. What we know matters, and we shouldn't let anyone convince us otherwise. One of my students, a woman named Dorothy whose daughter-in-law had been criticizing her holiday cooking, raised her hand. But what if they're right? What if we really have lost our touch? I thought about that question, about how many times I'd asked it myself over the past 3 years. Then we practice, I said simply. We go back to the basics, we trust our instincts, and we remember that cooking is about love, not performance. And if someone can't appreciate the love you put into a meal, that says more about them than it does about your cooking. The bread the students made that day wasn't perfect. Some loaves were lopsided, others were a little dense, and a few came out slightly burned around the edges. But when they sliced into their homemade bread and tasted it, warm and fragrant from the oven, their faces lit up with pride and satisfaction. That's what Jessica had tried to steal from me. Not just my confidence in the kitchen, but my joy in feeding people, my satisfaction in creating something nourishing and delicious with my own hands. She'd tried to reduce me to a series of failures and disappointments, to make me doubt the very abilities that had sustained my family for decades, but she'd failed. In the end, her lies couldn't stand up to the truth written in Helen's own hand, couldn't compete with the memories of family members who remembered what real love tasted like. Last Sunday, I hosted my first family dinner since Thanksgiving, using nothing but Helen's original recipes. The dining room was full, David and Carol, Aunt Mary and Cousin Tom, even some neighbors who'd become friends through my cooking classes. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by compliments on every dish and requests for recipes. "Margaret," Aunt Mary said as I served dessert, "this meal reminds me so much of Helen's Sunday dinners from when we were young. You've brought back something we thought was lost forever." I looked around the table at these people who loved me, who appreciated what I brought to their lives, who saw my cooking as a gift rather than a burden to be endured. This was what family was supposed to feel like: supportive, appreciative, warm. After everyone left, David and I sat in the kitchen, surrounded by the happy chaos of dirty dishes and leftover food. He reached across the table and took my hand, the way he used to do when we were young and everything felt possible. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "Not just for exposing Jessica's lies, but for finding your way back to yourself." I squeezed his hand, thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. It had started with humiliation and betrayal, with the sickening realization that someone I'd tried to love had been systematically destroying my self-confidence. But it had ended with truth, with justice served quietly and completely, with the restoration of everything that had been taken from me. I didn't need Jessica to apologize or suffer or acknowledge what she'd done. I didn't need her to fail in Seattle or struggle to find her place in the world. Her punishment wasn't my responsibility. My healing was. And I had healed. Not just from the wounds she'd inflicted, but from the deeper hurt of feeling forgotten and dismissed by my own family. I'd reclaimed my place in the kitchen, my role as the keeper of traditions, my identity as someone whose love could be tasted in every dish I prepared. The cinnamon rolls are cooling on the counter now, golden and fragrant, exactly the way Helen used to make them. In a few minutes, I'll call the neighbors and invite them over for coffee and warm rolls, because that's what I do now. I share my cooking freely, generously, with people who appreciate it. I don't cook to prove anything anymore. I don't cook to win approval or avoid criticism. I cook because I love it, because I'm good at it, because it connects me to the woman who taught me that the secret ingredient in any recipe is the love you put into it. And I have so much love to give. Tomorrow, I'll teach another cooking class. Next week, I'll host another family dinner. Next month, I'll try a new recipe from Helen's collection, something I've never made before, but that she perfected decades ago. I'll continue to honor her memory not through perfect execution, but through the joy I find in feeding people, in carrying on traditions, in keeping alive the recipes that taste like home. Jessica may have tried to steal that from me, but she failed. Some things are too strong to be destroyed by lies, too precious to be diminished by manipulation, too deeply rooted to be pulled up by someone else's insecurity. I am the keeper of Helen's recipes, the guardian of our family's traditions, the woman who turned simple ingredients into expressions of love. I always was, even when I forgot it myself, and that's a truth no one can take away from me.